So as social marketing turns 50 years old, I think it's definitely a time for celebration, as I think there's lots of things that we've done over the past 50 years. And as a discipline, we have grown and created positive change and achieved some great successes because we know social marketing works. If we take the time to do it properly, we know that social marketing can have a significant impact on the quality of life for many, many people. And in that video, we can just see a few examples of some of the impact that social marketing has achieved. We know that the repeated success of social marketing is based on a systematic bottom-up planning approach that also always starts with developing a really deep understanding of the needs and the wants of the people we're striving to help, whoever they might be. But today, I'm not really here to just talk about the wonders of social marketing. In fact, after working in the field for nearly 20 years now, the ongoing pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has made me question how fit for purpose is social marketing in something like a pandemic. As with other respiratory infections, such as the flu or even the common cold, public health measures are critical for slowing the spread of COVID-19. So then you might think that social marketing is really well placed to develop effective campaign messages, activities and interventions to support the desired behaviour changes in relation to the preventative measures. Now, I was one of the people trying to do this at the very start of COVID-19. I was trying to work and use social marketing to improve these outcomes. And I was trying to follow the social marketing planning process. However, I realized really quickly that this COVID pandemic was something new that I'd never experienced before, in that the data was constantly changing and the behaviors I needed people to do were constantly changing and evolving. So I needed to react really quickly and develop, test and implement interventions in the space of days or weeks, not months as I usually have. Basically, I needed to be far more nimble. Because if a recent pandemic has shown us nothing else, it's indicated how nimble a virus can be. And this is where I started to question, is social marketing really fit for purpose in such a rapidly changing situation? And if not, how can we make social marketing more nimble? Over the years, I feel as if there's been many different definitions for social marketing and many different introductory texts for the discipline. They often talk about things such as a management system or having a systematic and stage planning process, integrating research, best practice theory, insights, etc. And these are all really important things, and it's all correct. But the result is, I often think it leaves people feeling a bit like this. So a lot of the colleagues that I work with, whilst they recognise there's no magic bullet and no quick fix to the behavioural issues we're trying to deal with, social marketing often doesn't appeal to them, because social marketing, rightly or wrongly, is often an add-on to their day-to-day job. And when we explain the planning process and all the steps we need to go through, to be honest, it's a bit of a turn off for them. You know, they like the concept, but then the practice is not so appealing to them because they think, well, how am I really going to do it? And to be honest, at the start of the COVID pandemic, when I was homeschooling these two little boys who look very cute, but believe me, they are dreadful students, and I am also a dreadful teacher of them, I realized. But I started to feel pretty overwhelmed. I started to feel like this as well, because there I was trying to apply the social marketing process in this really rapidly developing environment, and I just couldn't develop and quickly test the interventions and messages I needed to following that process. Basically, I didn't have the luxury of time to spend months collecting formative research. And to be honest, I couldn't even go out into the field most of the time to collect the data I needed. So that's when I started to think, how can I take the principles of social marketing and the basics of social marketing, but try and do it in a more agile, nimble way? And that's when I started using something called nimble trials. Very simply, nimble trials try to decrease the gap between research and action by testing short-term outcomes quickly and cheaply. In many ways, it is very quick and dirty. But I first read about them in 2017, and they were published and discussed in a World Bank publication. And I think the phrase was originally coined by Dean Carlin, who I think is an American academic. Now, when I first read about them back a few years ago, I was quite excited, if I'm being honest, and I mentioned them to a few colleagues, but most of my colleagues were very apprehensive about using them. As again, in social marketing, we take pride in doing things not quick and dirty, you might say. We're quite robust and systematic in our approach. Then, to be honest, I forgot about them completely until I was trying to do the COVID-19 work at the very start of the pandemic. And that's when I started to think, well, how can I start to apply them and use them now? So nimble trials, they're also sometimes called nimble evaluations or rapid fire evaluations, but basically they're used to really quickly gauge the effectiveness of something and to develop a rapid, specific evidence base, which was really vital in the COVID pandemic because we needed that very specific evidence base about what works and what doesn't work within this world that at the time, because I was using these back at the start of the pandemic, it was a very frightening, scary world, to be honest. So I used them in two ways during the pandemic, and I'm going to explain to you just a little bit about how I used them and the benefits I found of using them. So the first was to understand the impact of messages, of campaign materials, of ad sets. Now, normally, if I was asked to develop a campaign, I would conduct formative research after I'd done a secondary review of the evidence, I'd carefully pre-test, etc. But as I said, I didn't have the luxury of time. So I had to use the existing data that was already out there. I was unable to collect primary data because of safety regulations. So as I said, I had to use the secondary data available. Now, luckily, with some of the target audiences that I was working with, I already had some data that I'd collected the years previously. I'd, a few years ago, stopped the way I did formative research. I changed it a bit, and I'd stopped asking siloed questions about the public health areas that I was looking at. Because I found that actually, even though in public health, we might look at these problems in silos, whether it's tobacco, alcohol, or obesity, when it comes to our target audience, they don't look at the problems in silos. And in fact, just understanding knowledge, attitudes, beliefs in relation to our separate topic areas, I found not very useful in the end, because it stopped me understanding really the social, cultural and behavioural dynamics that interplay with people's everyday lives and that subconsciously affect our decision-making processes. So a while back, I'd started to ask these kind of more general questions to just get an understanding of really what makes people tick. So luckily, I had this type of data I could also use when thinking about the different interventions and different campaign messages for the social marketing work that I was doing in relation to COVID-19. So based on the existing data that I had available, I would create some campaign messages. I'd create some very basic ad sets, which would look a bit like this. But instead of pre-testing them, so normally in social marketing, we pre-test things very thoroughly, which is really important to do. But that pre-testing activity is predominantly a one-off activity. But I didn't have the luxury to do that. So the way I pre-tested it and piloted it all in one was basically to select a random sample of my target audience. I would go to them on day one and I would interview them and I would get their gut reaction to the ad sets. Kind of like we do in pre-testing work. We'd get them to say, well, what do they like about it? What do they not like about it? What do they understand by the messages and the images? Who do they think they're for? You know, do they resonate with them? All those types of questions. But then what I do differently in line with this nimble trial methodology is I'd go back to the same people 7 days later and I'd say, well, what do you remember? Of the ad sets and the messages I showed you, which ones have stuck in your minds? Have you discussed it with anyone else? And most importantly, has anything changed as a result? Now, what I learned by actually doing this method is that actually sometimes it was the messages and the ad sets that they hated the most that had actually impacted on their behaviour, that had stuck in their minds and had resulted in change. And I found this really interesting because if I'd done the more traditional approach of pre-testing, if somebody had really hated an ad set, I tended not to go with that ad set. But actually, I worked out through this method that actually it's often the ad sets people hate the most, that make them feel the most uncomfortable, that they criticize heavily, that actually had impacted on their behaviour. So I found it really useful in relation to the COVID messages and imagery that I was having to develop. The second way I used it was to rapidly evaluate outcomes of a mix of social marketing interventions. Basically, I just needed to rapidly understand what works or what works best in different contexts. So the first place where I did this in early, I think it was about March, April 2020, so again at the start of the pandemic, was in relation to hand hygiene in Tajikistan. And I was working in very rural parts of Tajikistan where they don't have internet, they don't even have mobile phones. Very rarely do they have a TV. They're quite very isolated, beautiful communities, but very isolated communities. And this work was done for the World Food Programme. We already had some data around what makes them smile, what are their motivators, etc. So we could use that. And we also used the global evidence base, the key insights from other hand washing studies done elsewhere. And basically the main key insight was that people think they're awesome at washing hands when really they're not very good. So based on the available data we had and the evidence base, we created an overarching campaign and ad sets and messages, and then we developed a number of interventions that kind of fed in and supported that overarching campaign. Some of them were like this kind of nudge, choice architecture agenda. Some were interpersonal communications because, of course, we couldn't do mass media within those communities. And some were developing products and services to support the desired behaviour change and create a positive social norm around hand washing with soap and water within those communities. To test them out, we basically selected 5 villages, and in each of the different villages, they received a different element of the intervention mix. And in the 5th village, they received nothing. So that was our control village. And we just did 10 households per village. These households were randomly selected, but it was a really small sample size. And basically we did a baseline one day. We launched the interventions the next day. Then we let the interventions just run for 2 weeks. And then we did our follow-up measurements. What was really interesting is we got really good results, actually showing that nudges alone were pretty ineffective, but actually the interpersonal and the support mechanisms were very effective. But what was really interesting, even though it was such a small sample, when the pandemic calmed down a bit, we actually did a quasi-experimental study doing the same methodology, but having like a proper sample size, and we got the same results. So even though we just did 10 households and we did it very rapidly, we still got the same results as when we did it with a larger study later on. So the benefits for me of using this approach was that it was quick and inexpensive. We got the data we needed really rapidly. So we didn't waste funds researching or collecting lots of data, or often doing an evaluation where you find out 6 months or a year down the line that things haven't worked the way you thought they would work. But most importantly, it helped me convince management to allocate further money, and it made me give rapid feedback to donors. So within a month, I managed to upscale a lot of those interventions to many communities in rural Tajikistan. Now, if I'm looking at this in a puristic way, if I was to be asked to review this work as a social marketing professional, I would have so many criticisms of it. Believe me, I know that this was very quick and dirty, but at the same time, I think there is an argument that sometimes with social marketing, we have to think, how can we be more nimble when things such as the pandemic and future pandemics hit us? And it always just makes me think about many years ago, I remember working with an amazing conservation charity who wanted to do social marketing. And the first session I had with them, I was explaining the process, explaining what needed to be done, how long each of the normal stages of the planning process takes. And they turned to me and they said, we love the idea of social marketing, but we're not going to do it, because actually we're trying to preserve and save this certain breed of rhino, and we think within 6 months the last one will be dead. So, you know, it kind of came back to me during the pandemic, this quote and this information that people had told me then. So I just want to give special thanks because here I am talking about these projects, but actually it's always the people on the ground implementing these social marketing interventions that are the real stars of any of this work. And with the project in Tajikistan, these two people, Nitesh and Shamshia, were amazing. They were the ones on the ground implementing all my ideas and concepts, going out when actually we were quite nervous to go out into public areas. So I want to give a special thanks to these two amazing people who you won't know in the social marketing field, but really they're the stars doing the social marketing work on the ground, the unsung heroes, you might say. So thank you very much.
Rowena, thank you. Thank you for sharing your post-COVID experiences. It's raised some fascinating questions for me, just like Fiona's talk has as well, in relation to COVID and social marketing, where we've come from, but most importantly, where we want to go, where we need to go over the next few years as well. So I would invite all of our